Please, 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 please. Looks like victory!
Hi everybody, thanks for dropping by. Today we're going to be talking about why I personally am skipping Acheron, and the reasons why maybe you should too. Now, the goal of this video is not to discourage Acheron wanters from pulling for, but rather to discuss the limited pull options for free-to-play players. Obviously, if you're a high spender, whale, or just in the position that you've already saved up 900 pulls towards E6 S5ing Acheron, this video won't really apply to you, but this is more for people who want to optimize their pulls, newer players especially, who are concerned that skipping Acheron might be missing out on something absolutely game-changing. And while she's clearly going to be performing very well, I think that there are a lot of situations, especially newer players might find themselves in, where she might not be the best pull for you right now. And say even if you really want her, you might be better off waiting for a rerun. Since free-to-play players have a far more limited number of pulls than others, it's important to take into consideration the specific scenario that each player is in. And while I'm unable to cover all possible circumstances for the some 20 million or so players of Honkai Star Rail right now, as someone who started more recently and isn't a high spender, I felt like it may be good to discuss your options in regards to upcoming banners and why you're pulling what you're pulling, what you should be considering when you are pulling, and so on. Of course, naturally, the first thing that you should be considering when you're deciding who to pull is if you like the character, if you enjoy the design, their animations, their personality, or anything else associated with the character themselves. Hoyo games are not pull this character or you won't be able to clear content at all. People have been brute forcing off-element MOCs. Story content isn't really difficult enough to warrant being super concerned with even the specific setups of your team. Events have been more closely orchestrated around the limits and functionality of your team, but in general, almost everything is entirely clearable, almost no matter who you pull. I mean, I know there's a guy here on YouTube, I've seen a couple of his videos where he demonstrates being able to clear all of the game's content without ever having pulled it all. Now that said, I've been seeing a lot of praise and hype for Acheron that, while it's not unwarranted, a large number of content creators and Redditors have been telling people that they'll regret not pulling Acheron, or that she's extremely free to play or even new player friendly, and I just don't think that's true. A lot of content creators are kind of glossing over her specific issues, and I have a feeling that on release, a lot of opinions are going to shift wildly the opposite way, and I also think that that's not very true or accurate. Acheron is not whale bait like some people have stated, but she does require a higher level of investment than I think most people may be anticipating, and also than a lot of players are able to provide for her. I think a lot of content creators are approaching Acheron from the perspective that they're going to be easily able to pull her Eidolons, easily be able to pull her signature Lightcone, which makes a massive difference. And if you have the budget to get an E2 S1 Acheron, she's probably one of the best investments you can make in those terms. But an E0 S0 relying on gacha Lightcones, she might have a harder time performing than I think a lot of people are playing her up to be. I mean, obviously, if you can spend, and that's what you plan on doing, that's your decision, but I'm also aware of how many players, due to circumstance or their country of origin, are very strictly free to play. So here we're going to go over my particular situation. I'll try to apply it to others, particularly newer players who maybe haven't been around in-game for all that long, considering how many completely new to the game players the 2.0 update attracted. So we will try to approach from a different perspective than a day one free-to-play or a light or even medium spender who's more recently picking up the game. As someone who started at the tail end of the 1.6 update, my non-standard 5 stars consist of Kafka, Black Swan, and Ratio, who was given out for free, and will be into the 2.1 update. After 2.1, no more free Ratio, but that still gives you quite a long time to claim him. Acheron is also more reliant on Lightcones than a lot of characters that have preceded her, with many characters having been able to use freely obtainable Lightcones from either the Memory of Chaos store or the Herta store in Simulated Universe. But we already know for certain that Acheron is not a DOT character, making this Herta Lightcone close to worthless on her. It is not going to be high value. And then if we look at the Nihility options in the Lightcone store here, you can see that, this one could be workable, but it's going to be far below what her signature Lightcone is offering. And where's the other one? And then this one is just basically worthless. This one, Acheron does not apply debuffs and relies on her teammates primarily to do it for her with her signature Lightcone. Maybe unlocking the ability to apply debuffs, maybe her Eidolons. But as it stands, she's not applying them herself, and you're not building her for effect hit rate. She's a classic DVS, but in the Nihility category. And then, absolutely none of the rest of these are Nihility. Just checking. So, this leaves probably her best quote-unquote free-to-play option as Good Night, Sleep Well, which will increase your damage by a certain percent for every debuff on a target, up to 3 times. We know that Acheron wants your characters to apply debuffs, and my one Superimposition 2 copy of Goodnight Sleep Well is pretty glued to my Kafka, who is one of my only 5-star DPSs at this point. So at best, I'd be swapping Kafka for Acheron, maybe. And then if we want to talk about Teamcomps, our best supports are liable to be Pella, who requires the Gacha Lightcone Resolution Shines as Pearls of Sweat, which not everybody's going to have even one copy, and it will require you to build effect hit rate on Pella, ideally, in order to proc debuffs every turn. Aside from that, if you have her E4, you can use her skill to apply a debuff, but in particular, this debuff isn't doing anything beneficial for Acheron, and it makes her SP inefficient. So without the Gacha Lightcone, her basic attack doesn't apply a debuff. So if you're already not using Lightcone on Pella, she's not building stacks for Acheron every turn, unless she's at least E4, and then even if she is using SP to do so, which is not as ideal as just being able to run her on resolution, since that's SP positive. And more than likely, we can imagine that Acheron's going to want to skill every time she gets a turn. And you're probably going to want to build her with some speed so she can take multiple turns. So she'll be eating into your team's SP pretty consistently. Aside from Pella, her next best support is probably going to be Silverwolf currently, considering the sheer number of debuffs she can apply. And then obviously if we look into Silverwolf, she's also going to want to be skilling every turn. This is assuming you have her. And also the defense shred on her ult being pretty significant. So while it's fortunate that Pella will be on rate up if you need to pull her for Acheron, and you're planning to pull Acheron alongside Gallagher, who may or may not be a functional sustain unit for Acheron if you're in the very common position that you're lacking many sustains, but we'll get into our optimal sustain soon. And while Acheron will work with a core of Black Swan and Kafka, she'll be totally functional considering they both apply debuffs very consistently and pretty quickly. They're not really going to scale the best compared to our optimal supports. So if you're lacking those, you can only really build one sort of team, and we all know that you want 2 to be able to clear MOC, Pure Fiction, and so on. And then of course we have to consider that if you are using Silverwolf, there's a pretty good chance that the Lightcone most people are going to be wanting to use on her is before the tutorial mission starts, which is an event limited Lightcone that I don't have, and anybody who started after that event was run does not have. Now, of course, there are other options for her. If you have Eyes of the Prey, you can run that because it does give you the effective rate that Silverwolf really wants to have. Fermata doesn't really do anything for Silverwolf, and ideally you're running Resolution on one of your other supports for Acheron. So in general, the team altogether will have pretty limited Lightcone options. And then outside of potentially Bella, Silverwolf, Kafka, Black Swan, her next best options are probably going to be Lil Gui, who's able to apply a debuff with her basic attack, even though it is just burning, and does have the ability to give enemies vulnerability thanks to her talent that will increase the damage taken by enemies. But Gui just isn't offering as much as Silverwolf is, which will further diminish the ability of your team. And also, you come back into the issue of Lightcone selection. You could probably get away with running Eyes of the Prey, assuming you have it. But then we come down to the sustain of Acheron's team comp, which is going to be best fulfilled by a preservation unit. So we're talking Fushuan, Chapard, and Aventurine once he releases. In the current state of the game, the odds that you can solo sustain with March 7th or Fire Trailblazer is pretty low. But the reason you really want a preservation unit as you sustain is specifically this Lightcone. Trend of the Universal Market will apply a burning DOT to every enemy that attacks your unit, and this will provide Acheron stack every single time your preservation unit gets hit. For Pure Fiction, you can probably get away with Fire MC. Fire MC has the bonus of being able to use a taunt with their skill or his there. This also counts as a debuff on the enemy, so on turn you'll be applying one, and then off turn you can use Trend of the Universal Market to apply more, with each burning effect applied to an enemy, giving your Acheron one stack to charge your ult. I'm going to keep this video relatively math light, but in general, this one gotcha Lightcone is liable to increase your stack generation for Acheron by anywhere from 25 to 30%, and this will be doubly true in Pure Fiction, which is where you're more likely to get away with using Fire MC, March 7th, and so on. But unfortunately, without a high superimposition on Trend of the Universal Market, you're still building effect hit rate, which aside from Fire MC, basically no preservation unit really wants. Now, if we're talking about Acheron, her best Lightcone option for non-sig havers is gonna be Goodnight Sleepwell. And while it will be on rate up in her Lightcone banner, that means you have to spend enough pulls to get Acheron, and then spend enough pulls to get at least one copy of Goodnight Sleepwell, which is not guaranteed. So if you have absolutely none, I just find it highly ill-advisable to go spending on her Lightcone banner, potentially get up her rate up, and then try to pull Acheron. Meaning if you're not coming into the banner with the pieces of the puzzle that you really need to put together, you're going to be highly incentivized to spend to round it all out, even if you're just going for E0, S0, E0, S1, unless you have a major backlog of saved pulls. There's no reason to assume that Acheron's Lightcone will be beneficial to other units in the Nihility category, so unless you're guaranteed to get Acheron and you have enough pulls to guarantee your signature, it's kind of risky pulling on her if you don't already have a copy or two, or especially ideally an S5 Goodnight Sleepwell. And I've seen a lot of people come out and say, well, her best supports aren't out yet, you just have to wait for her 5-star supports to appear, which we don't have a timeline on, we don't have a deadline on, and it could be several patches before we see that, like how Dan Hung and Bibber Lune specifically, just got his best support in the form of Sparkle, which if you are able to pull for her, your Dan Hung is grateful. But that's kind of the dichotomy with these things, is that if you want to pull a character and you go, they're not really performing where I want them to, you have to save your pulls until you see a character that's going to synergize with them really well, which could be in 2 patches, 3 patches, or 6 months. There's really no way to know. Unless you're willing to drop a ton of money as soon as that character appears, you end up saving your pulls, skipping characters who might have otherwise built you a better team than you've been rocking with your current Acheron after pulling her. As it stands, we have absolutely no way to know what future Harmony, Nihility, Abundance units will be offering to their teams, or what future DPS will operate off of. We currently have Ron May as the #1 best buffer for universal use in the game, and her kit is heavily centralized around Break Effect. But we have only really Zhuyi, who focuses on Break Effect in order to deal DPS. So while Ron May is already performing incredibly well, we could see a DPS in a 5-star variant who centralizes on break effect in particular and makes even better use of Ron May than the teams we're seeing now. So if we're going based off of future proofing, it's hard to argue specifically for Acheron that her best supports aren't out yet. You just have to wait for them. Skip all your characters, even if you already have Ron May, or you have Dan Hung and Sparkle, or even just Dr. Ratio and Sparkle, who's already a great core team comp. If you started in 1.6 like I did, maybe the only difference between our rosters is that you do have Ron May. This means that if you're going to pull Acheron, you're benching maybe a DOT team, or you're benching Dr. Ratio, who is liable to put out very similar single target damage to what Acheron will be doing, assuming high investment, but also he has far more accessible free-to-play friendly Lightcones, easier farm for relics, even if they're not optimal, and is in general easier to build since he applies his own debuffs by default, since he pairs well with a massive number of units in the game. And I see a lot of people approach the topic of past DPSs as though they've reached their peak and that Acheron will only get better with time, but current DPSs won't. Like Sparkle is the end-all be-all for Dan Hung in Bibiter Lune, but for all we know we could get a Harmony soon that buffs your DPS based off the number of skill points they spend. And we just, even if you follow the leaks, don't know what every character in the future will hold. So the only thing I feel comfortable saying that Acheron is strictly power creeping at this point in the game is how completely insane her technique is. If you watch the live video, she doesn't expend technique points when she doesn't hit something. She instantly kills basic enemies and deals massive damage on battle start when hitting elites or bosses, which I would say is pretty significant. But aside from that, and her insane animations that we've seen, Acheron really isn't power creeping anything. And if you've been pulling on the last couple banners, odds are you've gotten maybe a Harmony unit. You know, maybe you got Sparkle, maybe you have Bronya, things that'll pair well with Ratio you got for free. Maybe you pulled Kafka Black Swan, who can synergize with Acheron, but you're still going to end up with one team out of that. And maybe you do just want to try to zero cycle with Acheron, Kafka, Black Swan, something like that. But if you want to build a second team comfortably, you might want to focus on filling out your roster in other ways. The game offers a limited number of freely available sustain units, buffers, and so on. I know we're getting a 4-star selector in 2.1. That'll be pretty helpful, but 5-star sustains are way ahead of their 4-star counterparts, while an E6 4-star DPS just isn't falling so far behind their 5-star counterparts that if you max out their Eidolons, they're not that bad. Like, they're totally usable as long as you synergize them with elements. And the main reason to overinvest in your 5-star DPS is that you can use them and their power level to brute force through like off element content, brute force through MOCs that aren't really built for them. And we know that Acheron ignoring type weaknesses will be able to do that pretty comfortably, but that's really only assuming you're able to support her, build her, give her at least a mostly ideal Lightcone, and confine her to her strict team requirements. Now, my personal pulling plans are going to be for Luoka. He's been getting heavily shafted by content creators and Redditors from what I've seen, which I wouldn't say is completely unfair. We have better offerings in the sustain category, like Ho-Oh or Fujuan, but plenty of people have neither of those units. I don't know when Fujuan's getting another rerun. I don't know when Ho-Oh's getting a rerun. Luoka is still a highly SP efficient healer with not really much difficulty in building him. You can give him practically unleveled relics, underinvest in his traces, and still see him perform really well, whilst having the ability to remove buffs from enemies, whilst being able to cleanse your team. And I'm not saying that just because you're a new player, Luoka's like a must pull for you. We could totally see Gallagher be a meta healer. We're not totally sure what his numbers are going to look like yet. Not totally sure how SP efficient he's going to be. His animations are phenomenal, and he will be on rate up during the duration of Acheron / Luoka's banners, so he's totally going to be an option if you plan on pulling on that banner at all. The reason for my personal choice to pull Luoka specifically is because I want Gallagher very badly. I want Pella Eidolons. I also wouldn't really mind building OG Dan Hung. And I plan to skip the second half of 2.1. So if you want to pull Aventurine, he could totally be a phenomenal option. Whereas seeing that he's pretty eligible to become a solo sustain unit himself and do well for it. The only reason that I'm skipping the second half for sure is that I really want Boot Hill. So I mean, this video isn't about trying to get you to skip Acheron because I think she's bad or ugly or underdeveloped or being a hater, but I'm seeing how restrictive she is for a new player. Depending on your luck, maybe if you pull Japard from the 5-star starter banner thing, you might have a better time. Assuming you have Trend of the Universal Market, assuming you have Good Night Sleep Well, assuming you have good luck pulling Pella, or you have Resolution Shines as Pearls of Sweat. All of these things are going to make Acheron a more appealing pull for your account in particular, but she's not about to be the game's first must-pull unit. Her damage is almost definitely going to be comparable to Jingliu, who still performs incredibly well no matter what you put her up against. And I mean, if you've skipped every DPS so far, really want Acheron to be your first major 5-star, so on and so forth, this isn't about convincing you not to pull at all, but also knowing that players who are on the fence about Acheron, thinking maybe they're missing a must-pull unit, can totally pick up Jingliu, they can pick up Aventurine, and you can in fact pick up Luoka. He's not going to suck just because he doesn't do much other than heal your team. That's actually kind of a big deal, especially as a newer player. The newer you are, the less likely you are to be able to clear more difficult content, bosses, MOC, and so on without needing your sustain to do their job well. As it stands, we get Natasha for free, and realistically, she's just not that good. We get Lynx for free, who is pretty good, but has minimal synergy with Nihility units in particular, or really anything that's not destruction and preservation, as her E being able to take aggro off the squishier members of your team, assuming you have a destruction and preservation unit in the team, is kind of beneficial for her fulfilling her role. So if all you have is already Nihility units, Dr. Ratio, who's Hunt, and really no other 5-star DPS teams to build yourself out of, Lynx isn't doing all she can. And she's still going to work, but then even assuming that, maybe you have Bailu, who does offer a tremendous amount of healing. That's undeniable. She can't cleanse. At best, she can cleanse once per combat instance by letting that particular teammate die, but really she's just kind of there, and enemies are getting more and more ways to CC you or apply debuffs, DOT, and so on, and that's not a trend that I expect to see change anytime soon. Not to mention that Acheron herself is going to be severely affected by CC debuffs and DOTs. Well, not so much the DOTs, but she will be negatively affected by CC, and her entire team will be, in much the same way that Xingwan is, where her ability to ult, being the primary source of her damage, will be held back if her teammates lose turns that they would be applying debuffs on. And also, no offense to the fans, but I don't want to use the Dragon Lolly. And I mean, that's pretty much it. Stop sleeping on Dr. Ratio. Consider liking and subscribing if you want more from me.